We now come to a very important physician of Rome, Claudius Galen. He was another of these Greek physicians who practiced in Rome and lived between 131 to 201 AD. He went to Rome from Greece and he revived the ideas of the Hippocratic school. He was a very talented, a very gifted individual who had studied in Alexandria. He became a surgeon to a school of gladiators at the age of 28, but in 161 he moved to Rome with the sole intention of becoming very famous and very rich, which he did, and he was very, very successful. And once again, he was another of these Greek doctors who became rich and was looked upon with suspicion and envy by the Romans. So 166 AD, it became all too much for Galen and he was forced to leave Rome. However, 2 years later, he went back to the city in response to a personal invitation by the emperor. And joining the emperor's household means that not only he became rich and famous and celebrated once again, but he enjoyed the protection of the emperor's household. He remained in the city until his death at about its 70 years. Now, Galen revived the Greek medical ideas and methods of the Hippocratic school. He put great emphasis on being a good clinician. He examined the patient very, very thoroughly. As you remember, Hippocrates laid down the basis of clinical observation, and he also placed great emphasis on the interpretation of the symptoms and signs of the patient and how the patient would be treated. We see there a fresco from Herculaneum, and you can see there a surgeon treating a warrior with an incision to the thigh. Now, just how important both Galen and Hippocrates were is shown by this medieval illustration in a printed book. In the center we have Galen, Galenus. On the left we have Hippocrates, abbreviated as Hippocra, and on the right is someone that we will talk about briefly later. This is the Arabic physician, Avicenna. So those three physicians were actually the pillars of medieval medicine. So as you can see, all of these were very, very famous physicians that wrote widely, and it's their writings that were actually preserved in the Dark Ages, the Middle Ages, and their writings formed the basis of medical practice of the Middle Ages. Now, Galen accepted the view that disease was the result of an imbalance, a disharmony between blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and blood. Black bile, not blood bile. What have I written there? Blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Correct it, please. Galen also believed in the healing power of nature, or in Latin, this is vis medicatrix naturae. Vis, power, medicatrix, healing, naturae, of nature. And he developed various treatments to restore the balance of the four humours. There were many mineral and herbal elements that he described, and these are called galenicals. You may actually be surprised to hear that cold cream, which is still being used, is something that Galen first concocted. Galen believed in the use of opposites. If someone had a fever, he treated it with something cold. If someone had a cold, he would treat it with heat. So you can understand where this arose, this idea of imbalance and restoration of harmony. People who were weak were given exercises to build up their muscles. People who had breathing problems were given singing exercises to strengthen the voice and the breath. Galen didn't dissect human corpses, but he dissected pigs and apes to help his knowledge of anatomy. He actually wrote a book called Anatomical Procedures, and he advised his students to dissect animals in order to further their knowledge of human anatomy, to extend whatever knowledge they developed in the animals to the humans. He actually did make some important anatomical discoveries, but at the same time he propounded a lot of errors, simply because there are differences between animal and human anatomy. Now, Galen had a profound influence. Because he was protected by the emperors, he could work with lots of money provided by the emperor, protected from his rivals who were jealous of him, and he also believed very firmly in propounding his knowledge, in sharing his knowledge, and that's why he wrote a lot of books. And these books, as we've said, were still used in the Middle Ages, well into the Renaissance. For many medical students, they were the primary or only source of information on medicine well into the Renaissance. Now, this once again is the idea of the four humours that was expounded by Galen, as you remember: yellow bile, black bile, phlegm, and blood; hot, dry, wet, cold; the four elements: fire, water, air, earth. And depending on which of these elements predominated, for example, yellow bile predominated, you became a choleric person. Black bile predominated, you became melancholic. Phlegm predominated, you became phlegmatic. And blood predominated, you became plethoric. Notice that these terms have been preserved in our language. For example, we still use the word melancholic to describe people who are down and not very cheerful. Melancholic in Galen's schema meant that there were too much black bile in the body and you had to take some treatments in order to expel that black bile. And you can understand where this arose from. Someone felt sick and had a stomach ache, probably something like gastritis, where you had a bit of bleeding into the stomach. You went to Galen, he gave you an emetic, something to make you vomit. You brought up all of that stomach contents, which was coloured black because of the leakage of black into the stomach and change of blood into black. There you are. You expelled the bile by vomiting it up. You felt a lot better. Plethoric meant that you had too much blood in you and you had to be bled. We still use the word plethoric in order to describe someone who's corpulent and looks red. And having too much blood in you also meant that you were liable to have sexual excesses. So in order to moderate those, you had to be bled. Interesting. Choleric meant that you had too much yellow bile. And once again, you can easily imagine how this arose. If you vomited up some stomach fluids which were tinged yellow because of leakage of bile into the stomach, it was easy to understand how someone might think that there was an excess of this body fluid. Choleric actually means that you are very angry, and you can see there in that wife bashing that this choleric man obviously needs a remedy in order to relieve him of his yellow bile. Possibly give him enough so that he carks it and the wife then becomes a merry widow. Phlegmatic means that there is too much phlegm, and too much phlegm makes you rather quiet and not very fiery and likely to be more subdued. And that's something that we still use today in our language. Someone who's phlegmatic is not too interested and very even-tempered, and someone who doesn't engage too well. Phlegm, of course, could be found in all sorts of body secretions, and I only have to draw your attention to having a cold, and then you cough up large amounts of phlegm, or you blow your nose and you can see evidence of that phlegm. So a remedy is needed to get rid of that excess of phlegm. Now, the fall of the Roman Empire is something that we should consider next, and how the Eastern Roman Empire became the Byzantine Empire. Now, on the peninsula of the Golden Horn, between northern Greece and Asia Minor, was the ancient Greek city of Byzantium. And Constantine the Great, who was a Roman emperor, 272 to 337 AD, enlarged considerably this city of Byzantium and formally christened it the New Rome in 330 AD. This was quite important because Byzantium was a good trading outpost. It had a strategic position between east and west, north and south, and it controlled very important trade routes. So to Constantine, it made great sense to strengthen the city and build up the city as a trading post. Because of Constantine's involvement in building up the city and making it a glorious new Rome, it was named in his honor Constantinople, which means in Greek the city of Constantine, Constantinopolis. Constantine had chosen the site with care on the site of ancient Byzantium at the frontier of Europe and Asia, and it dominated that very important trade route, both land and sea. Nature also protected that site from three sides with cliffs, and on the fourth side, with sea on the three sides, and with cliffs on the fourth side. So when I show you the illustration, you'll see that peninsula protected by sea on the three sides and cliffs on the western side, the fourth side. Various emperors following Constantine fortified the city, so it had very, very high, strong walls, three abreast, in order to protect it from attack. Now, during the 4th and 5th centuries, Visigoths, Huns, and Ostrogoths unsuccessfully threatened the city, which was flourishing, but at the same time, Rome fell to these same enemies. So, as the Visigoths, Huns, and Ostrogoths destroyed Rome, and the Western Roman Empire declined, and Western Europe went into the Dark Ages, Eastern Roman Empire survived and became the Byzantine Empire. Here you can actually see the center of the Byzantine Empire with the red arrow pointing to Constantinople. You can see there that it dominates the trading routes between Asia and Europe, and also controls both the Aegean Sea as well as the Black Sea. The Eastern Roman Empire of the 5th century AD is in yellow, and you can see how the whole of Greece and a lot of Central Europe, as well as Asia Minor and going right down to Syria, was in fact taken over by the Byzantines of the Eastern Roman Empire. Now here is a map showing you the city of Byzantium, now Constantinopolis, shown up there in the label, Byzantium nunc Constantinopolis. And you can see there how you have the walls on the western side, and that's the very, very strong walls up the back, and you then have sea on the other three sides that protects effectively the city from attack. Now in the 7th, 8th and 9th centuries, first the Persians, then the Arab forces, and finally the Bulgarians besieged but failed to take Constantinople. And also the Crusaders weren't too kind to Constantinople. They were in fact traitors, because as fellow Christians you would expect them to protect Constantinople, but they in fact sacked Constantinople in order to rob it of its gold. So the city actually withstood all attacks until 1453 AD, when the Ottoman Turks finally succeeded in taking the city. Now, Byzantium and the Byzantine Empire was one of the richest empires that the world has known, and also it was one of the most civilized and cultured empires, but it also had its share of intrigue and brutality and violence and warfare. However, it was the security and the wealth that was provided by its setting that helped Constantinople and Byzantium and Byzantine Empire to survive for more than 1,000 years. So while Europe was in the midst of the Dark Ages and the Middle Ages and starvation and warfare and destruction, the Byzantine Empire flourished. Constantinople was a state-controlled world trade center which enjoyed continuous use of a money economy in contrast to the localized feudal systems that were found in the West. The city's great wealth and the taxes paid by the citizens all over the empire provided a very strong army. It financed an efficient government with good administration and bureaucrats, and there was excellent sewage and water systems which supported a very high standard of living, and that's in fact the Roman legacy. Food was abundant, grain was imported from Egypt, Anatolia, fish from the Aegean. There was fertile land all around the cities which provided it with fresh produce. Now, Constantinople supported a population of 1 million at a time when it was very, very difficult to find a city in Europe in the Middle Ages that could sustain more than 50,000. Now, here we see a very famous mosaic in Byzantine Italy of the Emperor Justinian, arguably the first significant emperor of the Byzantine Empire. Now, Justinian is in the center there holding the bowl, and we can see there on either side of him his bureaucracy as well as his priests. Remember that Byzantium and the Eastern Roman Empire was a Christian empire, because on his deathbed Constantine was actually converted to Christianity, and there was that legacy of Christian tradition in Byzantine Empire and preservation of Christianity through the Dark Ages, but also the development of Greek Orthodoxy by the Byzantine Empire. And with the exception of one emperor, Julian the Apostate, all emperors were in fact Christians, and we will come back to this because Byzantine religion was an important moving force in the empire. Now here we see a Byzantine manuscript of the Iliad in the original Greek, and it's annotated in Greek. So the most salient aspect of Byzantium was the transmission of a classical culture. Now initially, when Constantine first set up the new Rome and Byzantium, the language of Byzantium was Latin. But gradually, by the time of Justinian, Greek, classical Greek, was having more of an influence, and that was because remnants of the Hellenistic Empire were flocking to Constantinople, and they brought with them all that classical tradition. So eventually, emperors after Justinian started speaking Greek, and essentially the Byzantine Empire became a Greek-speaking culture, and it helped preserve the classical Greek culture, the science, the philosophy, which dissipated in the Latin West. Now, it was in Byzantium that Plato and Aristotle and Homer and all of the other philosophers continued to be studied. They were transmitted throughout the Byzantine Empire and also the Islamic world. Eventually, with the fall of Constantinople in 1453, this classical tradition was taken back to the West, and it stimulated to a great deal the Renaissance. Now, basic education in Byzantium consisted firstly of a mastery of the classical Greek literature, Homer, and almost all of the classical Greek literature that we have today was preserved by the Byzantines, and the Byzantine monasteries especially. Now, unlike Greece and Rome during the classical period, during the Middle Ages, women actively participated in intellectual life of Byzantine culture. And while they couldn't attend schools, the aristocrats in Byzantine society could send their daughters to be educated by private tutors in literature, in history, in composition, in poetry, in philosophy, and also religion. The greatest of Byzantine writers was the historian Anna Komnene, and you can see there a fanciful large portrait and a mosaic, the smaller one below. Rather more plain in the mosaic and rather more idealized in the picture, as you can see. She was actually the daughter of the Emperor Alexius, and her biography of her father is one of the greatest works of literature in history. And it includes all of the histories that were written in Europe. This Alexiad that was written by Anna Komnene gives us a very, very vibrant, vital view of the Byzantine Empire and how life was in court at the time of the Emperor Alexius. Now, coming back to Byzantine religion that I mentioned before, remember that the Byzantine Empire was a Christian empire. And Byzantine Christianity was substantially different to Latin Christianity, which developed in Rome. And the predominant characteristic in the Byzantine culture and empire was that the emperors were essentially chief priests, and they officiated very much in the state functions of religious masses and other important rituals of the church. The Latin Church, on the other hand, had battled emperors for control of the church, and with the disintegration of the centralized authority in Europe and the Holy Roman Empire that developed around about 800 AD in the West, the various European fiefdoms and kingdoms that developed relinquished the administration of the faith and religion to the Pope. And the Pope became the primate in matters of faith, and as the Catholic faith spread throughout Europe, everyone relied on the advice of the Pope as the single person that made all decisions relating to religion. This is something that the Byzantines abhorred, and they actually said that yes, the emperor takes part in matters of state, and we need the support of the emperor in order to maintain the religious practices and belief, but we also have the leaders of the church, the patriarchs. There are several patriarchs, so you don't have a single person to make all decisions, and you have synods, that is, conferences, if you like, where you have all of these religious leaders coming together, discussing matters of faith, and getting a group decision, having collective intellectual power to make these all-important decisions that you could then pass to the population. So, yes, the emperor was a near divinity, or was much closer to God than the lay people were, and there was quite a lot of power, both temporal as well as spiritual, residing in the emperor, but also keep in mind the synods and the patriarchs that could influence policy within the church. Now, these two differing ideas about religion and how religious thought was administered in East and West led to the very famous schism, the religious schism, or separation of Eastern and Western Christianity. So Eastern Christianity became Greek Orthodox faith, and Western Christianity became the Catholic religion. Now, what produced this schism was the iconoclastic controversy. The iconoclastic controversy related to the use of images, of icons, the paintings of saints and Christ, and so on and so forth. There you can actually see an icon, a Russian icon, and the Russians were converted to Greek Orthodoxy by the Byzantines, and here we actually have a 20th century Russian icon painted by supporters of the Tsars, and you have the murdered Tsar Nicholas and his family, who were murdered by the communists in Russia, being sanctified. So it gives you an idea of that Eastern Christianity concept of emperor being very, very close to God and being in fact almost a saint. So they are the martyrs, the holy Romanov martyrs that have been painted in this icon. Now, Byzantine culture was extremely important because of the lines of transmission. Now, one of these lines of transmission involved exporting classical Greek and Roman culture into the East, where Islam had taken hold of, the Arabic civilization, and to a lesser extent a transmission of Byzantine theology into Islamic theology. The second line of transmission was Byzantine culture and religion to Slavic peoples, especially the Russians, as we've said. Orthodox Christianity was adopted by nearly all of the Slavic peoples around about 988 AD. So to this day, in the eastern part of Europe, Orthodox religion, not Catholicism, is the major form of Christianity practiced. We also mentioned how Byzantine culture was transmitted back to Italy from the east after the fall of Rome, with Ravenna, Venice and Sicily being very important Byzantine cultural centres. Now here we see the Church of Hagia Sophia. This means the Church of Holy Wisdom, Saintly Wisdom, built around about 360 AD, and this was one of the magnificent architectural achievements. You'll have to imagine it without the minarets, because that was a Turkish addition after Constantinople became Istanbul. So if you take the minarets away, you can actually see how the original building would have looked in Justinian's time. This is the interior of Hagia Sophia, but once again here we're not looking at the original, because the original was extremely richly embellished with mosaics, and the Muslim faith actually has a prescription against the depiction of the human form in art. So what was done was that all of these marvelous mosaics were plastered over, and you actually had on the plaster painted various non-representational paintings and frescoes. This became a mosque when the Ottoman Turks took over the church, and nowadays the church is a museum, and a lot of restoration work is happening to take back the plaster and expose the beautiful mosaics. This is an original mosaic which has had the plaster removed from it, and some of the most beautiful mosaics in Byzantine tradition are to be found in Hagia Sophia Church. So a gradual restoration to bring up these wonderful mosaics. To give you an idea of how the church would have looked, we go to a Byzantine church in Italy, which is St. Mark's in Venice. And here you can actually see the original mosaics and that wonderful shining background in gold, as well as the rich colours of the tesserae. Here are some more of these mosaics in St. Mark's, and you can gain an idea of how Hagia Sophia would have looked originally in Constantinople. This is a typical Byzantine church in Venice. Now, Byzantine medicine was based on ancient Greek and Roman knowledge, tending to compile works into textbooks, and these textbooks were used in medical schools. A very famous one is the textbook of Paul of Aegina, which was written on the 7th century AD. It's once again a typical compendium of medicine, or an encyclopedia of medicine. And very, very important in these books was the use of illustration, very rich illustration, showing the ailment, the patient, the herbs that are used, and so on and so forth. The first notable physician, we don't know the name of that physician, but he's actually the author of the Vienna Dioscorides manuscript, which was created for the daughter of Emperor Olybrius around 515 AD. He drew all of his material from ancient authorities such as Galen and Hippocrates, so it's derivative to a certain extent, but certainly very, very well produced. Oribasius, 320 to 400 AD, he was the physician of Julian the Apostate. He was the greater compiler of medical knowledge. Now, I mentioned Julian the Apostate before. Emperor Julian the Apostate tried to go back to pagan religion. He admired ancient Greek wisdom and philosophy and religion so much that he said, we will no longer be Christians, we will go back to the ancient gods. That was a very, very short-lived experiment, and when he was dispatched to the next world, Christianity came back with great fervour. So Oribasius, his physician, was a very great compiler of medical knowledge, and he made revisions, made notes, he corrected a lot of knowledge, and several of his works were translated into Arabic, Latin, and also into English and French. The last great Byzantine physician was Actuarius, who lived in the early 14th century in Constantinople, and he was a very great clinician and a great observer of symptoms and signs, and he actually described how urine could be used in the diagnosis of disease. So uroscopy, looking at urine and making diagnostic decisions depending on the appearance. Now here is a Byzantine manuscript on medicine, and it illustrates Dr. Mirepsos, who was receiving his patients in the 13th century. You can see there the lame and the sick coming in. Some of them are actually proffering him great gifts in order to heal them. And you can see that the physician on the left is actually examining a glass vessel full of urine provided by one of his specimens. On the right-hand side, we actually see an apothecary, and an apothecary's shop contained all of the remedies. That's where prescriptions were filled. And you can see the little apothecary's assistant there down the bottom on the right, sitting down and pounding materials with mortar and pestle in order to prepare a prescription that was written by Dr. Mirepsos. Now, a very important contribution of Byzantium to medicine and health is the fact that hospitals first flourished in Byzantium. They were actually set up by either individual churches or by the state itself in the big cities. The first hospital was actually built by Basil of Caesarea in Asia Minor. This has nothing to do with Caesarean section, but rather Caesarea is the city of Caesar, hence Caesarea, and Basil was in fact a saint in the Orthodox tradition. So Saint Basil of Caesarea was actually involved in hospitals as well. It shows you how closely the church was associated with medicine and health. This occurred in the late 4th century, but it was only throughout the 8th and 9th centuries that hospitals started to appear with regularity in even the smaller provincial towns as well as the big cities. Emperors subsidized private physicians to work publicly in the large cities' hospitals for 6 months of the year, so that's quite an important development in terms of public health. Byzantine medicine was based around the hospitals with walk-in dispensaries and casualty departments. They formed part of the hospital complex. There was a dedicated hierarchy, including the chief physician called archiatros, professional nurses, hipurii, and the orderlies, ipirete. In the 12th century, the capital city of Constantinople had two very large hospitals as well as smaller ones. These two large, well-organized hospitals were staffed by medical specialists, including women doctors, with special wards for various types of diseases and systematic methods of treatment, utilizing lots of herbs, minerals, various preparations of animal and plant origin, and these were concocted by the apothecaries and their assistants. Now, Saints Cosmas and Damian, that died around about 287 AD, were the Byzantine patron saints of medicine. And you can see them there, Cosmas on the left and Damian on the right. I don't know why I told you that, they look pretty much the same. They were called the Anargiri, which literally means in Greek silverless. That is, you go and get your treatment and you don't need to pay them with silver. They accepted no money for their services. They were practicing Christian charity. Once again, you can see that close association between religion and medicine. Now, you can see that they're actually holding spoons and those curious long oblong boxes that contain remedies. They are ready to dose up the patient by taking appropriate medication from the little drawers in that portable prescription filler box, if you like. Their most miraculous exploit was the grafting of a leg from a recently deceased Ethiopian to replace a patient's ulcered leg. And this was the subject of many paintings and illuminations. Here is a Western painting performing that leg transplant. So the first record, if you like, of an attempted transplant. Now, Christianity was a very important force in both East and West in the Middle Ages, and it played a key stabilizing role in the medical tradition and in the building and maintaining of hospitals. Many hospitals were actually built around monasteries or next to churches and were maintained by bishops in their bishoprics and prefectures. Hospitals were staffed by specialists, but also there were nurses who were nuns or monks. And that very close association between nuns and medicine was preserved well into our days. Quite a great emphasis was placed on belief in God and becoming healed through your faith and being saved both on a spiritual level as well as on a temporal level. So both spirit and body had to be healed. Therefore, the priests looked after your spirit, and the doctors associated with the hospital looked after your body. The Byzantines had a very great monastic tradition, that is, monasteries were built, often having lots and lots of monks and nuns that specialized as healers, growing herbs, medicinal herbs in adjoining gardens, and preparing their own medications. There were great libraries associated with monasteries, which acted as a repository of classical traditions and manuscripts that could be studied, copied, commented on, used, and learned from. Here we see the Eveiron monastery at Mount Athos. Mount Athos is a peninsula in northern Greece which is still retained by the church in present days, and it has a concentration of lots and lots and lots of monasteries. And this is one of them. It shows you that typical sort of protected environment, cloistered environment, with the church in the center and the living quarters all around it. And outside that fortified environment, you have the gardens and the fields that provided sustenance for the monks and also the medicinal herbs. Here we have three female saints in the Orthodox tradition called the saintly Anargiri, which means the three women saints who are silverless, that is, three women nuns, physicians, who once again will dispense their services without silver being paid to them, and this is part of the Christian tradition of charity through doing good works and healing. So these three healer nuns are Hermione, Philoniale, and Xenais. And you can see them once again holding attributes of the healing art. The box containing medication with the dosing spoon, a potion of some sort, and finally the manuscript, the cheat sheet, if you like, where she can look up her Hippocrates and see what prescription is needed. Now, the fall of the Byzantine Empire, we find that all good things come to an end, and this was the case with Constantinople and the Byzantine Empire. Remember that Roman Catholic Crusaders in 1204 AD came and overtook Constantinople by treachery, whereas the Byzantines expected these Christians from the west to be friends and to be able to fight side by side with them. Instead, they found that the Crusaders were treacherous. They destroyed their city, they plundered it, and they then continued to Jerusalem in order to liberate it. However, they survived the Crusaders in 1204 AD until 1453 AD. Under the command of Sultan Mehmed II, Muslim invaders, the Ottoman Turks, came and took over Constantinople by destroying essentially the Byzantine Empire and conquering Constantinople. Now, a lot of the Byzantines fled to the west, to Italy, and they stimulated the Renaissance and rediscovery of the Greek classics. That preservation of the Greek classics that they had in the Byzantine Empire was able to be taken to the west, and you had that new flowering of classical tradition in the west. Now, as a result of the Ottoman Empire taking over the Byzantine territory, the Byzantines and the Greeks became a tolerated minority, and the church was quite firmly subject to the will of its Muslim overlords. Patriarchs were found who could actually associate themselves with the sultans, and the administration of the church became corrupt, quite a lot of money being extracted from the population by the church and being given to the Ottoman sultans. And following the fall of Constantinople, Russian Orthodoxy and the Muscovy Empire, the Russian Empire, held that the leadership of the Orthodox Church had passed to Moscow, which came to be called the Third Rome. This, of course, now having become very, very staunchly Orthodox after it had been converted to the Orthodox faith by the Byzantines. The Ottoman Turkish occupation of Greece and the adjacent countries lasted until 1821 AD, but Constantinople was retained by Turkey after the liberation of Greece and is now called Istanbul. Here is an artist's impression of the fall of Constantinople. You can see there the mighty walls and the attack of the Ottoman Turks that led to the conquest of Constantinople and the fall of the Byzantine Empire. Now, the Middle Ages in the West is the period of European history from the 5th century to the 15th century. The period followed the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 AD. Remember how we had the Visigoths and the Ostrogoths and the Huns coming down and destroying Rome and sacking it, and then essentially breaking down the empire. This, in fact, gave rise to that period of the Dark Ages, where you had conflict, where you had destruction, where you had these barbarian hordes fighting amongst themselves and also establishing fiefdoms and kingdoms. And you find that the major stabilizing influence was once again religion in the West. And the Catholic Church was the major unifying cultural influence, and especially so the preservation of Roman knowledge through the Latin language. Latin, if you like, was the international language of the West in Europe, whereas Greek was the international language of the East. So West, Latin, Catholic Church; East, Byzantine Empire; Greek, and the Greek classical tradition and Greek orthodoxy. Bishops were central to the Middle Age society due to the literacy that they possessed. They knew Latin, they read it, they wrote it, and of course Latin was the language of the Catholic Church. They played a very significant role in governance, and it was from the bishops that you actually had the Pope assuming a chief role in Western culture by becoming the chief bishop in the Catholic tradition, and the Bishop of Rome was the primate, the first bishop in the Catholic Church. However, during the Middle Ages there were still many peoples with little or no contact with Christianity or with classical Roman culture. Now, the early Middle Ages in Western Europe also witnessed the rise of monasticism, development of monasteries, as we had in the East. The shape of European monasticism was determined by traditions and ideas that came from the East, with the ascetics that lived in the deserts of Egypt and Syria, and also the very strong Orthodox tradition with the monasteries and the monks and the nuns and so on and so forth. We also had preservations of conflicting ideas, if you like, to religion by the development of astrology and alchemy. And these developed from both ancient ideas and classical ideas regarding the influence of the planets and astrology and the stars on individuals and states, but also alchemy, which was quite important in terms of trying to transmute base metals into gold and refining the elixir of life. Quite a lot of that came from Jewish thought and the Kabbalistic tradition. So they were very, very important influences in the Middle Ages in the West. Here we actually see the invasions of the various barbarian tribes down into the Roman Empire, and the very famous battles between 100 and 500 AD. And you can see the great flux that occurred as the Roman Empire was dismantled and destroyed, whereas the Eastern Roman Empire became the Byzantine Empire, mainly through the preservation of the stronghold of Constantinople. Now, Hildegard of Bingen is a very important figure in the West. She's typical of the Middle Ages in the West in that she was a nun. She was also called the Sibyl of the Rhine. Sibyl because she was likened to the ancient prophetesses of the Romans, and she lived on the Rhine in ancient Germany between 1098 and 1179. She was the abbess of a Benedictine nunnery. She was an author, a mystic, a musician, and a healer. Very, very talented woman, but also she was a representative of that monastic tradition and showed how religious people involved themselves in medicine as an illustration of Christian charity and help to their fellow people. Now, mysticism was very important in the Middle Ages, and that went hand in hand with belief in astrology and alchemy, but also religious tradition and mysticism was an important element of the blind faith that we saw in religious ideas and Christianity in the Middle Ages. In the early 1150s, Hildegard wrote a medical encyclopedia called Liber Simplicis Medicinae, later called Physica, and notes for a medical textbook, Liber Compositae Medicinae, later called Causa et Curae. Hildegard was very, very well known as a healer throughout her zone of influence, and people were known to travel for hundreds of kilometers to actually go and have a consultation with her and be treated by her. She describes in her books the practical application of various tinctures, herbs, precious stones. She stressed the power of prayer and belief in healing, and she used Rhine water for various cures, so reviving that balneotherapy that Hippocrates talked about. Now, while things were going on in Europe in the Middle Ages, Islam and the Arab world developed. Muhammad, approximately 570 to 632 AD, was an Arab trader who later became a religious, political, and military leader. And he actually founded the faith of Islam, and also he was instrumental in unifying a lot of the Arab tribes. Muslims view him not as the creator of a new religion, but as actually the restorer of the original and uncorrupted monotheistic faith of Adam, Abraham, Moses, Jesus, and other prophets. and this is Islam. So in fact, it's a purification and a going back to the basics. So he saw himself as the ultimate prophet of God who was sent to earth to actually bring back the faithful to the true faith. So in the Muslim tradition, Muhammad is viewed as the last and the greatest in a series of prophets, a man closest to perfection and closest to God. Islam in the Arab civilization was another very important cultural force of the Middle Ages, and it influenced European thought and Byzantine thought as well. Here we see the spread of the Arab influence, and as you can see, we have that Arab influence beginning in the Middle East and Arabia, and gradually passing across northern Africa and ending in Spain. So Islamic Spain was a very, very important stronghold of that Arabic influence and tradition. Now, Arabic medicine is very important because from the fall of Rome until the European Renaissance of the 15th century, the Islamic world was the actual center of medical knowledge and new inquiry. The Arabs admired very much the Greek medical texts, so they translated all of these into Arabic and disseminated them widely in their empire, and they augmented greatly these ancient Greek texts with important annotations and new work with pharmaceutical information. They were able to add to the remedies many herbs and spices from the Far East, like nutmeg and cloves and mace, which were valued not as cooking ingredients, not as culinary ingredients, but rather as medicines. And many of the Arabic medicinal terms like drug, syrup, alcohol, alkali remain in Western languages. All of these are words derived from Arabic. Look them up in an etymological dictionary and you'll actually see how they all go back to the Arabic roots. The Arabs improved many Greek and Roman medical techniques, especially surgical techniques and eye surgery techniques. They also developed first-class hospitals, civilian hospitals, which they called bimaristans, and they used them not only to care for the blind and crippled and chronically ill, but also to train medical personnel. Note that there is also that Islamic tradition of charity and helping your fellow man. Now, usually these hospitals or bimaristans included medical and surgical wards, surgical rooms, pharmacies, clinics, libraries, lecture rooms, chapels or mosques. And some of these hospitals employed even musicians and singers to comfort the patients with music therapy. Some of the famous Arabic physicians of the Middle Ages, Ibn Riza, which is Latinized to Razis. He was from Persia, modern-day Iran, and was born about 850 AD. He wrote on a great number of diseases, but especially on measles and smallpox, differentiating between the two, and writing important clinical notes on symptoms and signs. His description is in fact the first accurate description of measles clinically. He also explained that a fever was something that the body did in reaction to an illness and helped the body to recover from the disease, whereas in Europe at the time, fever was treated by bleeding, which quite often killed the patient. Ibn Sina, or Latinized to Avicenna, he was born in Bukhara, modern Uzbekistan, about 980 AD. He studied medicine at 16 years of age. He was very, very clever, and he had a good reputation as a doctor by the young age of 18 years. He was an author, writing more than 100 books in his life, but perhaps his most important work was the Canon of Medicine. This was an encyclopedia of diseases, causes, and symptoms, and also treatments. So it was the first textbook of medicine as such, if you like. Although it was based on the work of Hippocrates and Galen, Avicenna augmented it and wrote down his own ideas and annotations. He described tuberculosis as a contagious disease, even though most Europeans at the time thought it wasn't. And of course, TB is a contagious disease that's caused by bacteria. Now, this canon of medicine was translated into Latin and was one of the fundamental textbooks of medicine well into the 17th and 18th centuries. Various others we can mention. About 1150, Ibn Rushd from Spain wrote a medical encyclopedia as well as various commentaries on ancient authors. Maimonides, working in Muslim Spain, was a Jew, and he was Saladin's doctor in the 1100s. His book on medicine became very, very famous, but he was also a philosopher, and he stressed preventative medicine and a healthy lifestyle, a holistic approach. We can see his statue there in Cordoba in Spain. Ibn Nafis lived in Damascus in Syria in the 1200s, and amongst other things, he was the first scientist to describe how blood circulates, long before Harvey in the West. So, summarizing everything that we've covered, we have to deal with three important civilizations: Rome, Byzantium, and the Middle Ages. Firstly, Rome. The Etruscans, a Near Eastern people, were the initial inhabitants of Italy. They were very, very quickly displaced by the Latins, who became the Romans that created the Roman Empire from about 100 BC to 300 AD. Greek ideas of medicine were imported together with Greek physicians who were very successful in Rome. There were great advances in surgery and public health in the Roman Empire. As the Roman Empire fell, we had preservation of the Eastern Roman Empire that acquired a classical Greek character and built on that classical civilization by incorporating Greek Orthodox Christian ideas. And Greek medicine was preserved, enhanced, and the hospital as we know it developed with a very strong monastic tradition with monks and nuns as healers. In the Middle Ages, the fall of the Western Roman Empire was succeeded by a period of warfare and destruction and loss of much ancient knowledge. We said that Christianity spread from Rome and the Holy Roman Empire with a brief resurgence of culture with Charlemagne, and the Holy Roman Empire developed the Catholic faith as a preserver of language and culture and healing traditions. But there were also the monastic healers, the nuns and the monks, and preservation of the Greco-Roman medicine. We also talked about the Arab civilization and how that also preserved the Greco-Roman tradition, but also expanded it and merged it with ideas of Islam as a religion. Once again, going to Hollywood to actually help us appreciate some of these cultures and how people lived in this time. I know that I've talked a lot, so I won't embellish too much on these various further offerings from Hollywood. Perhaps you have seen some of these already, but certainly they're readily available, most of these films and documentaries, so you can have a look at them and be immersed in the time period that we've been talking about. And lastly, of course, for further investigation, some links for you to follow on the web and read further on all of these ideas that we've discussed. This is the last lecture that I have with you in this subject, so I'd like to wish you well in your studies, and as always, wish you happy studies. Knowledge is there for you to acquire and develop, and remember that you are the person who drives your own learning. You are empowered by knowledge, and it's only through wisdom that you're able to use knowledge well. So happy studies.